This presentation is all about checklists. They're a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon, but for some reason they don't get much attention. My name is Julia. I'm the QA lead at ALM Works. We develop software for software developers. More specifically, we make plugins for Atlassian Jira. Our most popular is the structure plugin. If you want to take a look, you can find it in the top selling list on the Atlassian marketplace. In this presentation, I'll talk about what checklists are, where they're used, how to write them, and how they can help with testing. And we'll look at some examples of tools for working with checklists. What is a checklist? I'm sure everybody knows what a checklist is. It's generally a list of things to do, and you check them off as you do them. Check list. So, where are checklists used? Well, pretty much everywhere, from aviation and construction to healthcare and finance, and everything in between. There's a very nice book all about checklists called The Checklist Manifesto. It was written by a doctor named Atul Gawande, who researched the use of checklists in all types of different industries, from construction companies to financial institutions. He found that checklists are used everywhere and quite extensively. In the book, he cites an experiment conducted by the World Health Organization in which checklists were introduced in operating theaters in countries with very different levels of development. The checklist covered operating room procedures for before, during, and after the operation. The results were astonishing. Post-operation complications were reduced by 37%, and deaths were reduced by 46%. How could that be? Checklists reduced the element of human error, among other things. Here's an example checklist for an airliner pilot for use in case of engine failure. Understandably, it's very concise. If you're flying a plane and it breaks down in mid-air, you don't have time to read through a manual. You need the most important information and fast. So, what makes a good checklist? Different situations call for different approaches. Atul Gawande identifies two types of checklist: read-do and do-confirm. The read-do type prescribes a set of actions to be performed step by step. The do-confirm type describes the desired results rather than actions required to achieve them. With this type, you compare what you observe with what is described in the checklist, and either confirm that everything was done correctly or take remedial action if it wasn't. The second type of checklist gives more freedom and more room for creativity. Which type of checklist do you think is more appropriate for beginners? Which would you give to a novice? The second type? Do confirm? Actually, you should use the first type. It's easier for a novice to follow step-by-step instructions. In the second type, where you first do something, then check your results, we're assuming you already know how to do it, without following instructions. Whereas in the first type, you have a clear list of instructions to follow in a specific order. Here are some guidelines for writing good checklists. Each point should be written clearly and concisely in order for it to be understood clearly and quickly. If there are too many words, there is a risk that people just won't read them, might get lost in them, or just get distracted. In any case, unnecessary verbosity only leads to wasted time, both for the writer and the reader. Items in the checklist should be atomic or independent of one another. If they rely on other items in the checklist, it becomes harder to navigate the checklist and determine whether everything has been done or not. There should be as few points as possible, ideally no more than around 20 in a single checklist. If we're writing checklists for novices, we should use the read-do format, as this gives smaller step-by-step instructions to complete a larger task. But wherever possible, the do-confirm format is preferable. One of the reasons is that if we're doing the same thing repeatedly day in, day out, we begin to skip over the instructions because we're so familiar with them. In doing so, we become prone to eventually not reading anything at all, skipping items and making mistakes. Besides, people generally prefer freedom over having their movements dictated to them. The do-confirm format implies greater freedom in how to achieve the results it describes. Checklists are commonly used in IT before the start of projects to ensure that certain prerequisites have been met. Contact points have been established, team roles have been confirmed, and so on. They're used in interviews. For example, at our company, we have a basic checklist with questions that every candidate should be asked, and additional checklists with additional questions for different positions. Testing, I'll go into more depth on this later. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the role of checklists in the Agile definition of done. For preparing documentation, there are usually lists specifying what should be included. These are also a form of checklist. Continuous integration is a big thing now, and even here, checklists can help. For example, when deciding whether to deliver a build or not, a release engineer may consider various criteria, such as the number of times issues were reopened, the individuals who worked on the build, the size of tasks in it, peer review votes, and so on. There are some online resources with checklists for developers. For example, Userium, which provides a checklist for usability testing. And here's a checklist for web developers. So how can checklists help us with testing? Robert, stand up. Put your right hand out. And now reach down and back. Pick up the book. Take 3 steps. Diagonally. Hand me the book. Now, I could have just said, Robert, bring me the book. There was no need to describe every step of the process there, so why do we do it in our test cases? Incidentally, this is the book I'll be giving away as the prize for the best question. As I think we just demonstrated, it takes longer to write test cases. The testers in the audience most likely know how much pain it can involve. But we can actually cover a lot more ground with a checklist, even though it's smaller. Here's why. Let's imagine we're preparing tests for a simple registration form with fields for username, password, email, and a submit button. What tests do we need for the username field? We should test different character sets, digits, and special characters, and each different type of input should be represented by a separate test case. If we just combine everything into one big test case, we can't specify which type of input failed. So we should write separate test cases, complete with all the test steps and expected results, and all of these should be repeated for each field. That's a lot of work and a lot of repetition just to test a simple form field. Now multiply those test cases by every field in the form. We're going to repeat every time, open the form, enter this in this field, enter something else in another field, press the submit button, and describe the expected results each time. With checklists, we cut that down to just a few words. For example, we would have a group of tests called username field. And under that, we put the specific things we want to test: Latin, Cyrillic, numbers, special characters, and so on. That's just one word for each test, and if one fails, we can still specify which one exactly. If we wrote a whole test case for each input type, it would take far longer to write out all the steps as well as to read them and record our work when we execute the tests. Checklists, however, are not so well suited for user acceptance tests. Customers are more used to conventional test cases for acceptance testing. This format has the advantage that individual test cases are not dependent on context. All the information needed to execute a test case is contained in its test steps. The checklist format, on the contrary, is very dependent on context, especially if the test items are written in super concise style in a nested list. The context of a test item is going to be distributed among higher levels in the list, so it may not be so easy for someone to understand what exactly the word Latin expects them to test. However, if customers just want to see what you're testing without actually executing the test themselves, then a checklist is actually preferable, because it is far quicker to read and understand. So what tools are there for working with checklists? If we're going to write checklists instead of test cases, where are we going to write them, store them, manage them? To begin with, I wrote mine on paper. But I soon realized that this wasn't very sustainable. It was difficult to maintain them and share them with anyone else. So I started looking at what ready-made tools were available. First, I tried Cloud Checklist. It's an online resource where you can make your own checklists. It's not designed in any way for testing. It just lets you record a list of items that you can go through and mark. You can share them, for example, with developers or other testers, but it's really just a simple to-do list. You can record a date and put a tick beside an item, and that's it. There are no pass-fail statuses, which we really need for testing. Next, I investigated CheckVest, an online service that our developers are very fond of. They especially like how everything can be done with keyboard shortcuts. Items can be arranged in hierarchical lists, which is just what I needed for organizing my tests. In CheckVest, when you mark an item as done, the text is crossed out. There's no way to record a pass or fail status, so we just end up with a crossed out list. Organizing test runs was no simple matter. I had to create a new list for every run, and I couldn't figure out a way to review and compare historical test runs. I abandoned CheckVest and went back to looking for an alternative. This is Sitichko. It's practically a complete test management system. The test units in it are not test cases but checklists. A group of tests is simply a flat list where each item in the list is a test in which you state what you're testing and the expected results. You can add comments if you need them. Tests can be linked to requirements, you can work in teams and assign tasks, and you have to specify builds and environments for test runs. You can't do a test run in Sitichka without entering a build and environment, which becomes very time-consuming. And for my purposes, it was complete overkill. Entering builds and environments took too much time and really wasn't necessary for my purposes. So I carried on looking for something else. And then I found TestPad. It's wonderful. It's fast and easy to use, you can make nested lists, and it has the pass-fail statuses that I need. It lets you organize tests in hierarchies of any depth, which means I can group my tests. you can link to bug reports, and everything was great, but I was the only tester, and I also wanted to get our developers involved in testing. Unfortunately, the developers didn't want to use yet another system that they would have to log into every time they needed to do something in it. They didn't even want to register an account with TestPad, so that put an end to my dream of having developers help me with testing. Who uses Jira? Quite a few, I see. We use Jira too, and we even make a plugin for Jira called Structure, which adds issue hierarchy to Jira. Since Structure already provided the hierarchy that I needed, I realized we were just a small step away from having the ideal tool. So I asked our developers to make me a column where I could record test statuses. And that's how Structure Testy came about. Here you can see our Structure plugin. You can see the hierarchical list of issues with containers where I group my tests, and the columns where I record my test statuses. They can be passed, failed, blocked, or skipped. It automatically shows the user who set the current status. Statuses are aggregated upwards through the hierarchy, and at parent levels they can be represented either by the number of different statuses in the group or the most critical status in the group. So, if there is at least one failed test in the group, the parent issue will display failed. If they're all passed, it will display passed. I need both types of display for different situations. So that's what we came up with. A checklist tool for testing Jira issues inside Jira with no need to switch to another system, where I can enter tests quickly and link them directly to the issues they relate to. Now I have structures where I keep standard tests for use on every build, like sanity tests, security tests, and so on. And then I have separate structures for every build, where development tasks are automatically added by synchronizers, after which I add my tests to them. So now our developers can see my tests right beside the issues they're working on. This works very well, because our developers know in advance what I'm going to test, instead of only finding out later when I come to them with bugs that I found. They can see these tests on the issue view page in Jira or in my structure, where they can go through tests together with me. So now our developers can help me with testing, which is a massive bonus. We ended up with a tool not only for testing, but also for collaboration between developers and testers. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention. Questions?